Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can use the modes of the major scale to solo over static major chords. First off, if you'd like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 5.14 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now that you have an understanding of the modes, in these next few lessons we're going to dive deeper into how you can use them to solo over chords and chord progressions. And this is really what we've been talking about the most in this series, because we had already talked about how to build chords out of the modes in a previous series. I just didn't talk about it being the modes. We were talking about the one chord, the two chord, and so on, but that all relates to the modes, and I think by this point you should understand how that all relates. And really in this series what we're diving into the most is how to use the modes to solo over different chords and chord progressions. And in this lesson we're going to dive deeper into it and talk about how to solo over static major chords. And what that means is that it's just one chord looping over and over again. For example, if you had a G major chord, that's the only chord you would hear. It wouldn't be a chord progression like a 1-4-5 or anything. It would just be the G chord looping over and over. And we're only talking about the harmony having the chord tones of that G major chord, meaning there's no other harmony going on that's outside of those chord tones. For example, a G major chord is a G, B, D. There wouldn't be any notes going on outside of that G, B, D if there was other instrumentation along with this. So this is if you come across a chord, a static chord, meaning that it's just looping and there's no tones being played outside of that actual chord tones. And this is a really, really useful way to look at how to use the modes and how you have different options and how it gives you options for what mode you can play over certain chords. So one chord that's just a static chord that you're playing over, you're soloing over, you have more than one mode option for most chords. And that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. And there are songs that you'll run across that have one chord isolated that you can choose different modes to solo over it. And it might be a whole song just using one chord, or it might be a long section of a song and you have different mode options. But even if you don't play over songs like that, it's a really good way to understand how the modes work compared to chords that you're playing over. And then in upcoming lessons we're going to talk about actual chord progressions where it's not just one chord, it's a progression with multiple chords. So the first thing we're going to look at is a major triad. So you know that's just a root, a third, and a fifth. And if you were going to solo over the major triad, any major triad chord, you'd have the option of using the Ionian mode. And you know that an Ionian mode is root 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, that means that these tones of a major triad, a root, a third, and a fifth, a root, major third, perfect fifth, are straight out of the Ionian mode. So that means you can use the Ionian mode to solo over any major triad. And if we are in the key of G, a G major chord, a G major triad, the notes are G, B, D, that's the root, the third, and the fifth of the G major scale. You can use G Ionian to solo over a G major chord, and the G, B, D are right in the Ionian scale. And that means when you're soloing over it, these chord tones, the G, B, D, are going to be your strongest ones, the strongest tones that you can land on, and you're not going to have any problems with them at all. And then your other tones you have to be more careful, and your fourth, which is a C in the key of G, is an avoid note, which I had mentioned in a previous lesson where that's just a note you don't want to land on and rest on. It wants to go back to the B or up to the D. So Ionian is an option if you're just playing over a static major triad, but so is Lydian, because exact same reason. Lydian has a root, a third, and a fifth in it, so the chord tones of a major triad are right in the Lydian scale. So Lydian can be used over a major triad chord to solo. And if it was a G major chord, G Lydian, those G, B, D are right in there, which G, B, D make up a G major triad. And then you have the other option, you have Mixolydian. So you have all major modes that you can use over a major triad, because every major mode has a root, a third, and a fifth in it, meaning that if you were to build a triad off the root of any of the major modes, you're going to end up with a major triad. So you can use any of the major modes to solo over a major triad. And with Mixolydian, if you're soloing over a G major chord, a G major triad, you'd use G Mixolydian. Again, the G, B, D is right in the scale, which are the chord tones of the triad. So that means if you want to solo over a major triad, which is just a root, a third, and a fifth, root, major, third, perfect fifth, you have the option to use any of the major modes. And again, we're talking about static harmony. We're talking about just if that triad was looped over and over again, it wasn't part of a chord progression. And the different modes that you use are just going to create different sounds over that triad. So if you use Ionian, it's just going to be the major scale sound over it, and a sound that we're all very familiar with. And you're going to have to be careful of the 4, because that's an avoid note, because of the major triad has a third in it, a major third, and that's a half step away, so that's a minor second, which is the dissonant interval. So when you're playing Ionian over a major triad, you just have to be careful and not land and rest on that 4th. Or you could use Lydian instead of Ionian, and that's going to be a brighter major sound, not as recognizable of a sound because we're so used to the major scale, but a really nice sound. And that 4 now is a sharp 4, so it's not an avoid note because it's a major second away from the third now, so it's a less dissonant interval. Or you could use Mixolydian, and this time that'll create a very bluesy major sound because of that flat 7, which we've talked about before. And again, the 4, just like with Ionian, is an avoid note for the same reason. Now, if you come across a major triad and you're soloing over it, you have to be careful. It's not that easy just to interchange these modes and use all 3 of them over that chord. It takes a lot of practice to be able to do that, and it doesn't always work or sound good for the situation. So usually you're going to pick a mode and use that, or at least use it for a while, and then maybe switch to another mode to create a new sound. So that's just something to be aware of, that it's not easy just to mix these all up and use them over the chord at the same time. Typically you'll stay on one for the whole time, or stay on it for a while and then maybe mix it up, but that takes a lot of practice to be able to do. All I'm really pointing out in this lesson is that if you're soloing over a major chord, just a major triad chord, you can use any of the major modes. And each one is going to create a different sound because they each have their own unique character, which we've talked about in previous lessons. Now, if you're soloing over a major 7th chord, which you know is root 3, 5, 7, your only options from the major scale modes are Ionian and Lydian, because Ionian and Lydian are the only ones that have root 3, 5, and a major 7th from the major modes. You know that Mixolydian is a flat 7, so you're not going to play that flat 7 over a major 7 chord because the major 7 chord has the major 7th in it, so you're not going to play a minor 7th or a flat 7th. That's going to sound horrible over the major 7 chord. So if you're just soloing over a major 7 chord, you have the option to use either Ionian or Lydian. So if it was a G major 7 chord, you could use G Ionian or you could use G Lydian. And again, same thing applies. The 4th of the Ionian is an avoid note, just meaning not to land and stay on it, but the Lydian doesn't have an avoid note because the sharp 4 is less dissonant of an interval. And then if you were to solo over a dominant 7th chord, you know that the 5 chord is a dominant 7 chord, and the 5 chord is also Mixolydian, so that of course you would use Mixolydian to solo over a dominant 7 chord because Mixolydian has that flat 7 instead of the major 7th, and a dominant 7th has that flat 7, so that's why you'd use Mixolydian. So over a major triad you can use any of the modes. Over 7th chords, major 7 you can either use Ionian or Lydian, dominant 7 you can use Mixolydian. And again, over the dominant 7, the Mixolydian, the 4th is still an avoid note because of the distance between it and the major 3rd. And one thing I didn't talk about before was soloing over a suspended 4th chord. And you can solo over a suspended 4th when we're talking about major modes. You can either use Ionian or Mixolydian, and that's because they both have natural 4s in them, and a suspended chord is a natural 4 or a perfect 4th. You can't use Lydian because Lydian has a sharp 4, and that doesn't work over a suspended 4th chord that has the perfect 4th in it. And now when you're using Ionian or Mixolydian, the fourths that used to be avoid notes are no longer avoid notes because they're a chord tone. The ones you're going to have to be careful about now are the thirds, because now the third is a minor second away from the fourth, which is a chord tone. Plus, if you use that third over a suspended chord, it's not going to have the suspended sound anymore, because suspended is taking out the third. It's suspending the third with the fourth. So you'd have to be really careful about using that third and maybe just not use it at all. And here I've created new charts for you, which are the most popular major chords. Right now we're talking about major chords, which are the 1 chord, the 4 chord, or the 5 chord, which are Ionian, Lydian, or Mixolydian. So if you have a major chord, the formula again I've just left in is root 3/5. You can use Ionian, Lydian, or Mixolydian to solo over it. If you have a major 6, exact same thing. You can use any of the modes, any of the major modes to solo over it. Major 7th, like I said, Ionian or Lydian, because those modes contain major 7ths in them. You can't use Mixolydian because that contains a flat 7, which doesn't work over this major 7th, and so on. I've done that through all the chords that we've talked about so far in this series. And here's another part of the diagram. It's just continued. I just put them on multiple pages so it's easy to see for the video, but in the e-guide it'll all be on one page. Major 13 is the same thing. It's Ionian or Lydian are your options because that's based on the major 7 chord. Major 7 sharp 11, which we talked about before, is only Lydian because it's the one that has the sharp 11, which is the same as the sharp 4. It doesn't work with Ionian because Ionian has the perfect fourth, so that would clash really bad. And then all your dominant chords, which are based on dominant 7ths, a root 3/5 and a flat 7, are Mixolydian. That's your only option because Mixolydian is the only major scale mode with the flat 7. And then continued again, here are the other types of chords. Suspended second, you can use any of the modes, but you have to be careful about using the thirds because that's going to take away that suspended sound. Suspended fourth is just Ionian or Mixolydian. We just talked about that. 7 suspended 4 is only Mixolydian because the 7 suspended 4 has that flat 7 in there. And power chord is any of the modes, any of the major modes from the major scale. And as we'll talk about in the next lesson, you can use any of the minor modes from the major scale as well. Because as you should remember from the previous lesson, there's no third. So that means a power chord is not major or minor. So hopefully that helps you understand how you can use modes to solo over static chords. This is a really useful thing to understand, and you'll come across this a lot, whether you're just soloing over a 1 chord vamp where a song is just based on 1 chord, or whether it's a long part of a song where you have different options, or even if you don't use that often in real situations, it's a good thing to be able to understand the different colors of the modes and how they work. So those are your mode options for soloing over major chords. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson where we're going to talk about your mode options for soloing over minor chords. And be sure to download the e-guide. All these diagrams are in there. And be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.